In today's lesson, we are going to use Franklin Delano Roosevelt's The Four Freedoms speech that we used in the first part of our lesson to continue close and critical reading. All you need to do is return to the Google document that you already created, and you can continue to add comment notes in the margin, even though you already have some done. I've left mine as an example so you can see that we can add to them even though they're already here. The close and critical reading notes that we are going to use for this particular reading, or rather the strategies, are going to be to continue to identify those puzzling words, and we do that in the context of denotation. Denotation is really just the literal meaning of a word or the dictionary definition, so we'll review how we do that in electronic text. Another strategy we're going to use is looking at connotation, and connotation, if you remember from your exercise yesterday, represents the various social overtones, cultural implications, or emotional meanings that are associated with a thing. And the word may have a positive or negative tone. Some are neutral, but most are positive and negative. So we're going to look at identifying the tone of the connotation as another close and critical reading strategy. And then we're also going to use the tone from the connotations to help us with inferencing. What is it that the author is trying to say to us? Reading between the lines, what is the message he's intending, without coming out and explicitly stating it. So we'll see how all of those are combined. So we begin at the top with the introduction. Mr. President, Mr. Speaker, members of the 77th Congress. I address you, the members of this new Congress, at a moment unprecedented in the history of the Union. I use the word unprecedented because at no previous time has American security been as seriously threatened from without as it is today. So let's look at that first paragraph in the context of our close and critical reading strategies. If we remember that denotation is the dictionary definition, and we also are relating that to puzzling words, I think that unprecedented could possibly be a puzzling word. As demonstrated in a previous session, if you are reading text electronically, all you need to do is highlight the word, and in Google Docs, one of your tools is the define, and up on the right hand side, it brings up the dictionary definition. So unprecedented is an adjective, but it means it's never been done or known before. So the reason that this time is so significant is that even though we have seen security issues, it's not the same that we see right now. This threat is more serious, it's unprecedented, it's never happened before. So the fact that he repeats the word unprecedented and uses it to go on and define this time in history is also a connotation. And remember, again, the connotation is how the word has social overtones, cultural implications, or emotional meanings. So if we look at the word precedented, I can again go to insert and comment, but I've already made the comment over here, so I can pull it up and look at it. It has an emotional connection, right? This moment in history is different than any other moment. So FDR is not trying to say that we have never been threatened before, that we have never had security issues, but what they were facing at that current time had never happened before. It was unprecedented. And part of this was conveying an emotion of fear or worry. And if we think of fear or worry, we certainly would classify that in tone as having a negative tone. And you can refer back to the lesson that you did yesterday that had you identify words in terms of negative, neutral, or positive tone. Moving on to the second paragraph, since the permanent formation of our government under the Constitution in 1789, most of the periods of crisis in our history have related to our domestic affairs. And, fortunately, only one of these, the 4-year war between the states, ever threatened our national unity. Today, thank God, 130 million Americans in 48 states have forgotten points of the compass in our national unity. So when I think of our close and critical reading strategies, one of the things that stood out to me is the word threatened. And I think we're all comfortable with the dictionary definition, so we look at the connotation. So what is it representing for us in terms of social undertones or cultural implications or emotional meanings? And I've already created a comment here. So FDR is afraid that we will be harmed, that the threat to the country has cultural implications, right? So what is threatened is our national unity. And often when we think of these words like threatened, it seems to be a personal thing. We relate to being threatened ourselves. But that's not what FDR is saying. He's talking about our national unity. So our identity as a nation, or how we come together, is being threatened, and that's unique and different. So it certainly also has cultural implications as well as emotional, because it's threatening our very existence or the unity of how we exist. When we move on to the third paragraph, it is true that prior to 1914, the United States often had been disturbed by events in other continents. We have even engaged in 2 wars with European nations and in a number of undeclared wars in the West Indies, in the Mediterranean, and in the Pacific, for the maintenance of American rights and for the principles of peaceful commerce. But in no case has a serious threat been raised against our national safety or our continued independence. What I seek to convey is the historic truth that the United States, as a nation, has at all times maintained opposition, clear, definite opposition, to any attempt to lock us in behind an ancient Chinese wall while the procession of civilization went past. Today, thinking of our children and of their children, we oppose enforced isolation for ourselves or for any other part of the Americas. Considering our reading strategies that we're using today, 2 words stick out for me as I was reading. The first is peaceful, especially as it relates to peaceful commerce. So I'll highlight peaceful. And I think it's significant because it's defining a type of commerce. And that way the tone becomes positive. Peaceful is something people want. They don't have to worry. So exactly the opposite of the tone that he conveyed in the first 2 paragraphs, which were producing worry or a negative tone. He talks about we are interested in peaceful commerce, that this has always been what we strove to have, and what we've been successful in doing was having a peaceful commerce. And the next word I noticed is at the very last sentence when it says we opposed enforced isolation for ourselves. So while it's the entire phrase, what's significant is enforced. And it has cultural implications because it shows how we are different than the Chinese. So he refers to their ancient wall, and if you remember your world history, the Chinese had created their own culture and kind of boxed it in by creating this wall that was supposed to keep them safe, but also kept their culture contained and not out interacting with the rest of the world, and that he does not want to have that. So enforced isolation would have cultural implications that we're going to handle it differently, so our reaction to a threat is not going to be to close within ourselves, but also that it's not going to be enforced. So there might be isolation that occurs, but they're not going to force it. So this again becomes a negative tone. So you can see he's alternating between positive of what has been and what our ideals are, and negative of what is the reality that we currently face. Looking at the last paragraph that we're going to use for this lesson, let's read through before we do our strategies. That determination of ours, extending over all these years, was proved, for example, in the early days during the quarter century of wars following the French Revolution. While the Napoleonic struggles did threaten interests of the United States because of the French foothold in the West Indies and in Louisiana, and while we engaged in the War of 1812 to vindicate our right to peaceful trade, it is nevertheless clear that neither France nor Great Britain nor any other nation was aiming at domination of the whole world. And, in like fashion, from 1815 to 1914, 99 years, no single war in Europe or in Asia constituted a real threat against our future or against the future of any other American nation. What I noticed as I read through this is that, again, even though FDR is referring to wars and the United States engaging in wars, one of the things he is focusing on is the fact that we were engaged in war in order to vindicate our right to a peaceful trade. In this way, FDR is conveying that even though we may have been at war, peaceful trade in the context of war has a cultural implication of the United States engaging in war as a method of promoting or maintaining peace. And while those seem to be contradictory terms, he's trying to get across, again, related to our culture, that while we may be a peaceful nation and we desire peace, we also are willing to engage in war if that way of life, if that peaceful way of life is being threatened. So the peaceful trade is a positive tone, even though it's done within the context of a negative tone. So now that we have identified several instances of connotation and denotation, it's important that we look at the inference or inferring. What is the author inferring? And while we keep going back and forth between negative and positive tones, he is referring to a specific time in history. He's also referring to how we have handled ourselves in the past and projecting how that needs to change in the future. So my inference is that FDR believes that for security and peace, we may have to engage in war. Even though he has not come out, at least at this point in the speech, and said we need to go to war, he's laying the groundwork, I believe, for why it may be necessary by citing specific examples when it's happened in the past and what our policy is as a nation of being a peaceful nation, but a nation that when threatened will do what it takes in order to maintain that peace. This is an example of close and critical reading using denotation and connotation, determining the tone, and having that lead us to inferencing or what the author is trying to tell us. You need to continue these same strategies with the conclusion, and remember to share using the link to your completed document at the bottom of the lesson in the submission area.